Well, good Monday morning, everyone. And it's a little cooler this morning than I thought it would be, but it's just as humid, or at least feels that way to me. And it's Monday, July 27th. Today we're going to jump into, or we're going to continue, we're going to continue in chapter 2. We're going to continue in through verses 6 to 10 today. And as I mentioned Saturday, this is a little bit of a difficult at times passage, so we want to give it its due diligence. So let's take a look at what we talked about briefly on Saturday for those that might not have listened. The main thing is to realize that Paul and Barnabas and Titus have all gone to Jerusalem. And this is the story Paul's telling of the Jerusalem Council, is what I believe. Now, there are different people who have different ideas about this, and there's much argument about it. I think it's pretty evident and pretty clear. This is Paul's version of the Jerusalem Council. And he, in verse 2, addressed the leaders there as those esteemed as leaders that he went and met with privately. So they have a private, the Jerusalem Council is not a big event. It was the inner group, so to say, that was there in Paul's telling. And he said that even within their conversation, Titus was not compelled to be circumcised. And that's a big deal. That is an important part of this, because it's going to become more and more obvious and more evident as we go through Galatians, especially today, that the circumcision is really the crunch of the matter. And that's where there really is a loggerhead about things. And it's symbolic in many ways, but it's obvious why it's something that they would fixate upon, because for an adult male that is going to convert to Judaism, that's a big deal, especially as a Gentile, because the Gentiles didn't practice circumcision in the ancient world. Today we practice circumcision not because of necessarily religious reasons. It's more of a cultural thing or health thing or whatnot, and people are on both sides of that issue. It gets a little complicated. We're not going to dive into that because that's not pertinent to what we're talking about today. Okay, so let's jump right in, because again, I don't want this to become a 30-minute, hopefully it won't be, long conversation this morning. So let's jump into verses 6 to 10, and then we're going to talk about them. And again, remember this, and I mentioned on Saturday, this is Acts 15, is a great deal of this is going to tie back into Acts 15. All right. As for those who were held, this is starting at verse 6 to 10. As for those who were held in high esteem, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God does not show favoritism. They added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they recognized that I had been entrusted with the task of preaching the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been to the circumcised. For God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work in me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to us. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. All they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. Okay, well, it's obvious that there is some variation from here to what is mentioned in Acts 15. But before we get to that, we got to notice there's a little bit of passive aggressive, not really passive, is it? Open aggression towards the other Gentile or the other apostles, because at first he says those esteemed as leaders, and now he's saying, those that were held in high regard, whatever they were, makes no difference to me because I don't really care. And they added nothing to my message, meaning he didn't change what he was saying after conversing with them. This council, as far as Paul is concerned, changed nothing. It did nothing. Now, so let's take a look real quickly at what we see in Acts 15. And here it is the impetus, back sound before in Galatians, when they were the impetus to go to Jerusalem, seemed like that Paul took it upon himself and went there to meet with them. Here in Acts, that the church is sending him as a delegate. In chapter 15 of Acts, then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Fully, you're in all the way with the law, basically. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. So there's obvious book in Galatians, obvious in Acts. There's a issue with this whole thing about, do you become fully Jewish before you become a follower of Christ? We have to remember and bear in mind always that at this point in time, for certain, this is early on, that Christianity is not a religion. It's a sect within Judaism. And we also, and I alluded to it on Saturday, Paul's method of operation was to go to the synagogues, okay, where there were the God-fearers, the people that were Gentiles that hadn't gone all the way to become a Jew. They had not gone through a conversion process, but they were allowed to be there at the synagogues worshiping, and they were allowed in the court of the Gentiles. We could wonder, why would there be the court of the Gentiles? Why would anybody be in the court of the Gentiles? What's with that? Why would a Gentile want to be at the Jewish temple? Well, it's because you had a number of Gentiles that did worship the Jewish God, but they had not converted to Judaism. Partially especially because of the patriarchal society. If the father doesn't convert to Judaism, the family's not converting, okay? And the family's not going to convert to Judaism without the father. So this circumcision is a real sticky point, so to say. It's that part where I'm can't quite go there. Partly because, obviously for an adult male, that's an extremely painful thing. That's a dangerous thing because of infections in the ancient world. So it's a big deal, and it is a thing. Now, obviously, some did go through that process and convert, but there were a number of people that hadn't. And a number of those people were giving money not only to the temple, but they were giving money to the synagogues. And we know that because there in some of the synagogues, there are inscriptions saying a donation from a God-fearer, from a Gentile believer that had not converted. So these God-fearers. So part of what Paul's doing, and part of what gets Paul at odds with not only the temple, but the other Christians, is this idea, as my mentor and I, Jesse and I, would always want to say, he's poaching the God-fearers. He's coming in and bringing them in, and what he's telling them and selling them is Judaism light. His premise is that you are fully Jewish if you join this sect, whether you're circumcised or not. And that's really what gets him in loggerheads with the temple, and also with some of the other believers. So we have that issue underneath this. And we know that, let's go on, and we'll come back to that. In Acts 15, it says, the apostles and the elders met together to consider the matter, and after there had been much debate, you can imagine the debate, Peter stood up and said to them, my brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you, that I should be the one through whom the Gentiles would hear the message of the good news and become believers. So Paul has changed that little story a little bit too, because we know in the story of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 that Peter has the vision, and he goes and he converts Cornelius, and his whole family becomes followers of the sect of Christianity within Judaism. So first, Peter is the first one to go to the Gentiles, long before Paul converts. All right. So Paul's kind of taking on some of that glory of saying, I'm the one to the Gentiles, where in fact Peter had originally been the one. So Paul's, building himself up a little bit over here in Galatians. So Peter really was the first one to open the doors, and he's the one really at the Jerusalem Council that convinces James, who it's obvious is the head of the council, who's actually the head of the Christian movement at that point in time, in my belief, and others. He's the one that stands up and says this. And after they finished speaking, James replied, Simon has related how, and then he goes on. And then in verse 19, he says, therefore I have reached the decision. And that's telling us right there who's in charge. It's James, the brother of Christ, James the just, who unfortunately has been somewhat diminished by and left out of the New Testament. I wish there was more about James. That's why I'm such a big fan of James. And he goes on, therefore I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, cause them to have to go through the whole act of circumcision for one thing, much taking on the whole of the law. Because earlier Peter had talked about how why are we going to put the yoke on them, that the yoke that what the rabbis that teach for their teaching. Why are we going to put this whole yoke on them that we can't even bear? So he goes on, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. For in every city for generations past Moses has had those who proclaim him, for he has been read aloud every Sabbath in the synagogues. James right there is reciting Leviticus. This is what's required of the God-fearers. He's just affirmed, he's changed nothing actually. He's just affirmed what's already in place for how the God-fearers are to behave and what is to be done. They are therefore allowed into the court of the Gentiles if they follow those things. So this is what's going on there. And that's what's happened at the Jerusalem Council. Paul comes back and says the only thing that we have to do is collect for the church in Jerusalem. So it's one of those instances of, you have meetings and who hears what. We usually hear what we want to hear. Paul's not buying any of this. Of course, James didn't say that they had to be circumcised, but he also didn't say that they become Jews. And so, but I really think that Paul's selling to these Gentiles, these God-fearers, that if you're all in, you're just as good as any other Jewish person. And that's one of the things they accuse him of. Remember later in Acts, I didn't pull that up, later in Acts when he's arrested, they accuse him of bringing a Gentile in past the court of the Gentiles, right? I forget which one it was. It might have been Titus. I have to go back and look at that. But that's really one of the charges that's against him. Now, the interesting thing, the thing that we have to bear in mind is that, we have all this disagreement going on, as I talked about here, with James and Paul rather, and Peter. But remember in Acts that James and Paul do reconcile, because James or Paul, when he comes to Jerusalem again, he goes through a Nazirite ritual as directed by James. Okay, and James even has him pay for some others to go through this same ritual in the temple. And so this is Paul's reconciling himself to James. So in the end, they do come together, I believe, firmly. And in the end, they do reconcile, and they come to an understanding. So we have that. And again, this is the message to me of these two different stories. And the further in the story is this message of, yes, we've always had contention in the church. We've always had different ways of thinking. I wish Jesus would have spelled it out as to now as far as this and this. Well, he didn't. So they're trying to work this all out. And of course, we've got Peter's vision in chapter 10. So I think that Jesus really did want the Gentiles to come in. Now, I'm not sure that doesn't really, that's talking about the food law. So that would therefore then I think also absolve us from the idea of the circumcision. Of course, that was a very key indicator of division of the Jews, to the Gentiles, was that circumcision. It was something obvious of who was a Jew and who wasn't, because of that. But we have this reconciliation, the story of James and Paul coming together. Now, not everybody's reconciled, because the Jewish people are accusing them then later of Paul so there's still that contention there, and that's what gets Paul in trouble. later on. But hopefully I think I've got through about as much of that as I wanted to, quicker than I thought I would, actually. Not like there's a miracle. But it is difficult, and because it shows us there's some disagreement, there's some discord, there's some contention. But I do, again, and I'll reiterate it over and over as long as I'm on this planet, that we, rather than looking at that in dismay, we look at that in hope and understanding that because when we go into a council meeting and we have people very heated sometimes, I mean, people standing up and shouting and pointing fingers, that's not uncommon in church council meetings. For those of us that have been in church council meetings, that does happen. Thankfully not regularly, but it does come up. And so the same thing, we see the same thing going on with these early believers, and they too got through it. James and Paul rather, came to an understanding at the end, and praise be to God for that, because through Christ, all things are possible. Even those of us that have such diverse ideas, maybe we can someday even agree on the color of the carpet and the music. Lisa would love that, wouldn't you? Have them agree on what kind of music we have, because it's all about worship. So praise be to God. Let's lift up our voice in prayer to God this morning. We'll end in prayer. We didn't start in prayer, but because we're still long, but quicker than I thought I'd be God honest. So let's have a prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you so very much for the message of what we see here. And as we continue through Galatians, we will continue to see it, dear Lord. And we thank you for that message, that we too can be reconciled to one another as well as being reconciled to you. We thank you for this day. We lift it up to you. And again, Lord, we will ask that perhaps this week we'll get a wee bit more rain, because we still pray this in your loving glory. Amen. Okay, thanks for listening, folks. We'll continue on in chapter 2 tomorrow. And Paul and Peter get at it again. So round 3, I guess. See you then. Bye-bye. Be a blessing to someone today, by the way.